Hi, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for Blue Cottage Agency Author Talk. I'm Krista Sukup, and on behalf of the Blue Cottage team, we are excited to host our third show of the season. As always, we pair two authors together to read and discuss each other's books, and tonight we are going to be discussing two captivating true crime books. Please feel free to leave your questions and comments into the chat box. We'll be asking the authors throughout the evening. First, I'm going to introduce Frank Weber. He's a forensic psychologist and award-winning true crime author. He received the President's Award for his forensic work from the Minnesota Correctional Association. Frank provides psychological assessments in homicide, sexual assault, and domestic abuse cases and testifies as an expert witness. Frank has profiled cold case homicides and narrated an episode of Murdered by Morning on the Oxygen Channel based on a Minnesota case. He's the author of 6 true crime thrillers, including his most recent Black and Blue, published by Moonfinder Press. Black and Blue is an intense thriller about tenderness, passion, and resilience in an era when it's easy to be callous. A true crime lover versus psychopath. Was the murder racially motivated? What uniform did the killer wear, prison or police? Martha Burns is a native of New Mexico, was always a storyteller who embraced Albert Camus's theory that fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth. She earned a Doctor of Letters with distinction from Drew University and won the Faulkner Wisdom Gold Medal Award for short story. Her debut novel, published by Atmosphere Press, is both a tragedy and a dilemma of moral conscience. In this tale of cultural complicity, the community at best looked the other way and at worst enables abuse, leaving us all to ask, what is too much to ask for a boy? Blind Eye was also featured just in the new New Mexico magazine for what to read this month. So thank you both for joining us. And I am going to turn it over to Martha, and she's going to be discussing Blind Eye with Frank Cooper. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you, Krista. And hopefully I'm going to be talking about Black and Blue with Frank tonight. So first of all, I want to thank Krista, and I don't think Janelle's on, but I want to thank Janelle. And thank you for putting me together with Frank to discuss our books. I think it's going to be fun, especially to read a book by somebody you don't know, and then to get to really discuss it and ask all those questions you want to know the answers to. And thank you for making me a part of your writing group and your authors group. Frank, when Krista decided to match our 2 books and so forth, I decided I would order your book, but I wouldn't ask her anything about you. So I didn't do any of the checking up on the internet or anything, or reading any of your reviews. I just ordered the book. And you know, you can learn a lot about a book before you even read the first page by all of the front matter, the back matter, the cover, and so forth. And so I did learn a lot without actually looking you up. But the first thing that so there's several things I want to ask you before I even get to the first page of the book itself. But the first thing, of course, that caught my attention was your title. And I think it's a stunning title. And I'll tell you later why I think it's such a stunning title. But I was curious to know if you could speak to maybe when you decided to name it Black and Blue, on, you know, what the different themes you were trying to project on the cover of your book. Anyway, if you could address the title first.
Sure. Black and Blue, I actually came up with the title about a year before the book was ready to be published. And I was excited about the title, and I didn't tell anybody about it because I thought, I don't want somebody putting out a book before I get this out, because it's the perfect title for it. About someone who is dealing with a police officer who had some moral issues, and an African-American who was convicted, and getting it all sorted out. Because the case is a difficult situation. You have 2 suspects, where one is an African-American male who's a serial rapist, and you have another where it's a white male who is assaultive and abusive, who's also in law enforcement. And so you have two terrible people and you have to sort that out. And so I thought, well, Black and Blue would be a great title for it based on the occupations and the racial issues addressed in the book. The picture, the cover of the book is taken on at a bridge in Minneapolis. And I enjoy having a photographer take all my covers, and I go there and set them up, and all of the people on the cover of my books look like characters from the book. So the person on the cover of the book is the Zave character. He's a young African-American investigator who is sent to work with Jon Frederick, who's a white investigator, to look at this case. The case was a mess because it goes unsolved for a couple of years, and then an African-American is convicted of it. And then a couple of years after that, you have this white police officer who's engaged to the victim, who commits a crazy violent crime. And so they needed to bring in both white and Black investigators with all the racial issues involved to sort through it. And it was a mess. And all of this stuff, like when they opened the evidence box, nothing was bagged. All of that was accurate with the case. And so you're having to relook at a case, realizing that you can't use any of the evidence that was collected in a trial anymore because it's all contaminated. And it was interesting. Again, it ended up being my longest book to date. And just because there was so much that needed to go into it before I was finally done with it.
Well, I just think the title is stunning. And well, first of all, if I can remember a title, if I can't remember a title and I'm standing in a bookstore and I'm saying, I want to buy this book that I read about, but I can't remember the title, then I know something's off. But I thought the title was so memorable and from the first page. But I'll tell you what my first thought was when I ordered the book. And I remembered a book with this same title that I read quite a few years ago by Anna Quinlan. And interestingly, Black and Blue, and interestingly enough, it was about it's about spousal abuse, but the spouse was named Bobby and was a cop. But I think her choice of title back then, I never thought of it as anything other than the idiom, black, meeting someone Black and Blue. But it's interesting how our culture changes, and back then, I'm not sure we would have made whether we would have made the leap to blue being policing and Black being a racial. I thought it was interesting, and it also, I thought, tied so perfectly to your Kirkus review that you chose to put on your cover, that Weber largely succeeds at demonstrating how issues of race and policing are intricately entangled, and that's your title. So I thought it was a stunning title. The other thing, well, many things I learned, but the other thing I learned, and Krista mentioned it in her opening, is on the back of the book, in that little blurb that's supposed to catch your reader's attention in a bookstore. It says that this story is a true story of the search, the true story of the search for 19-year-old Sadie Sullivan's killer. And yet the copyright page refers to this as being an act of, as a work of fiction. And that standard disclaimer, this is a work of fiction, names, characters, places, and incidents are the product of the author's imagination. So I'm curious to know where you think the fact or the truth, the facts morphs into the fiction and back and forth. And I'm just very curious about how you work that.
Okay, so I take a case and I take all of the facts of the case, and what I did was I changed the city and the names. And so this way, because especially a lot of my cases happened in rural areas where you don't want to re-traumatize all the people from the community, where everybody knows the victims and everybody knows the offenders. So I rewrite them in a community, and it's interesting, the communities love getting the new crime, which is sort of funny. And at the same time, you're not shaming the old community, because the new community loves the idea, oh, yeah, our restaurant, our bar, our tap room or whatever, it's in this book. And So for that reason, I stated it's a work of fiction because it's not those actual places. But at the same time, the crime and the offenses committed in the crime are accurate.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. This is kind of a follow-up question. People who know me know that I adore libraries, and I worked in when I was between jobs in my career. I worked in a couple of beautiful libraries in New Jersey, and I found it really interesting where books were shelved. And I love the Dewey Decimal System. But for instance, in Cold Blood, which is now referred often to as the narrative nonfiction or a nonfiction novel, is shelved in the 300s with the social science. And yet the fiction is in the literature is at the 800 series. Where do you think your book would be shelved, or where would you like it to be shelved?
I would like it to be shelved with the fiction, just because I think that's where most of the mystery writers or mystery readers are looking for books. And I appreciated any advice you have on that, but I like creating a good mystery. And so I'm very careful with the way things are presented so that it challenges the reader to solve it, where you get clues along the way, but it's not easy. And to give you an idea of who might have committed it. This book, in a sense, is in some ways is more obvious, in some ways less obvious than my others, because there is only two possibilities, that you're basically looking at. Either this person did it or this person did it, as opposed to many investigations, you're looking at a wide array of suspects and maybe somebody that you haven't met. But this one, you have a good idea. It's one person or the other, just which one is it?
Okay.
It's interesting. I like I said, I'm not really sure where it should be, but I like mysteries. If that's where I'm going to look for a book, that's probably where I'm going.
And in a bookstore, you would imagine that you'd be on a shelf with the mysteries, right? Right. So, well, after I did all this reading the front matter and the cover and all that, I did start reading your book. And I will say that I don't know whether this is characteristic of all the books in this series, but you have in the front matter, you have a map, which I think is very helpful, especially for somebody like me who doesn't know the Minneapolis area or the Minnesota area very well at all. But I love the cast of characters. One of my favorite books by Faulkner has a cast of characters, and I refer to it. And in my copy, I have notes by each one of the characters to help me. But anyway, then I finally got started reading. And the first chapter, now, are you worried at all with the spoiler? If
I'm not.
What Frank does is he writes in, I think 8 point of views. Each chapter is in a different, it varies points of view. And he also starts in 2013 and moves all the way up to 2000, bounces back and forth a little bit, but to 2021, which I think is so interesting that you're right up to then you got it published in I don't know how you did that, 2022. But the first chapter is Zave's, he goes by Zave,
Yes.
His chapter, and all of your chapters are also written in the first person. So in this chapter, I was going to mention that on page 16 of this chapter, there's a sentence that I want to read everyone, that had I not been, say I picked up this book in a bookstore and I was flipping through when I read that line, we're not reading this book for, for this discussion and so forth, I would have continued reading. And this is the sentence. I mean, we already know that this is Zave and he's 25 and he's a cop. Right. And we already know that he's met this young woman in a grocery store, a white woman. But this is what he says. He says, the last thing I needed was to be flirting with a teenager engaged to a white cop. So we have your tagline for your book right here. And that line alone would have kept me reading. So I really found that a sentence that grabs you. But anyway, as I said, all the chapters, the book is written in the first person. And so what I wanted to ask you is that because there's 8 different points of view, and because the first person not only allows you to tell the story from this point of view and that point of view over a period of time, but it also gives you access to each one of these characters' interior thoughts. What are the challenges there? And facing those challenges, how did the opportunities to tell the story overcome the challenges?
That's a great question. And I guess that's how I enjoy writing. That as a forensic psychologist, I enjoy getting into what people are thinking and how they process things. I have an advantage a lot of writers don't have, is that I interview killers, and so I know how they think. I know how they rationalize behavior, and I just think that's an opportunity for me to bring that to the book. And a lot of my readers say those chapters are really creepy that come from the killer's perspective, but they enjoy them. They like to get an understanding of why people do what they do and how they rationalize it. In my book, Last Call, I make the comment, even killers are heroes in their own stories.
Oh,
And I believe that people find ways of rationalizing behavior. And I have to tell you, it was a challenge because I've always wrote this way. Because I initially didn't write to be published. I wrote to vent my work, and I put them in 3-ring binders and put them in the closet. And I did that for about 20 years. And then I felt like I was getting pretty good at it. But then you start wondering, is this just self-delusion? Because I'm not sharing it with anybody.
Yeah.
And so I decided back in 2016, I'm going to send my book to an editor. And I sent it to an editor first, and the editor sent me a letter back saying, nobody's ever going to buy a book written from more than one person's first perspective, that you have to rewrite it, especially your first book, in third person. And then I just thought, well, hell with it. Then I'll never be published because I don't really care. I don't want to write like that. This is how I want to write.
right.
And then I talked to Krista, and she referred me to North Star Press, and I sent them the book, and they said, this is great. You got to start on a sequel. This is going to sell. And what's funny about it is a month after I got that letter from the editor that no one will ever buy a book written by more than one person in first person, Gone Girl comes out, which is written the exact same way, becomes the number one book in the nation,
I hope you kept the letter.
Yeah.
Well, are all the books in the series written in the first person?
Yes.
So then how, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. My next question has to do with, how do you then grow the character when you've been in their head, your ongoing characters, and you've been in their head and they're changing somewhat over time, right? I mean, I just think that would be quite a challenge because, well, for instance, with Zave, what I had to remind myself in the early chapters, I had to remind myself he was young. And I mean, all the clues are there. I know that he's young, I'm told, but I had to remind myself he's young and he's not that far out of high school. And so I'm a long time out of high school. So but anyway, so I thought in this one book alone, his interior voice matured. So when I first read this book, I said, in ways, it's a coming of age story. But anyway, here I am. But so, do you go back and reread your books before you start the next one?
I only allow myself to write one book. I don't allow myself to start the next one until I'm finished because of my obsessiveness. Otherwise, I'd never get things done.
Yeah.
That I'd have too much going at any one time. With this particular book, here's something to think about, because I also think we're always in the process of growing. And so when you start out that book, the character is this person. And during the course of an investigation, you become wiser, you get a better understanding of it. You get more frustrated with aspects of it, but you get a more global understanding of the whole process of looking at a crime and why some things take priority and some things don't, even things that you think are important. And so it forces a maturation as you go on. And so I liked to have the people in my books having to deal with that.
Right.
This weekend, I'm talking about my third book, Last Call. And in that book, it's one of the characters is somebody who's kidnapped. And I counseled a kidnapping victim and we talked about how her thinking changed over time. And she wanted to be a character in one of my books, but not identified by name or location. And so that was the character for that. And you see, as she's initially thinking she can talk her way out of it, and then eventually trying to escape, and then towards the end, looking more at how can I leave evidence so they can convict this person, even if I don't survive it.
Okay.
So I like using that process. And with everybody in the book, that even some people are doing better, some people are doing worse. Like the Cheyenne character, you see some deterioration as the story goes on, and then finally a little salvation at the end. But
right.
And one of the things I have to share with you, and I would never compare myself to Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is like one of my favorite writers. But one of the things I loved about his plays is that he wanted to write about what people were thinking.
Right.
But in a play, they have to say it. And so you read any Shakespeare thing, and every person who starts talking is just like an explosion of words, because he's trying to get out all their thoughts and everything. And so they're talking out loud and saying these things. And I love that about his work, because in a sense, he was writing in first person from all of his characters.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's that dilemma, is how in the heck do you tell the story if you're not in their head, and if they're, anyway, I know it presents challenges, but I found consistency and growth. I mean, I only read, I think, as I've said, I only have read the 6th book. So I jumped into the middle of a series, and I could tell from reading the front page, the front matter, that this was a series. And so I got to thinking about this genre, if you will, of a series like this. And I know that readers, myself included, there's just something very enjoyable about picking up the next book, looking forward to the next book. I know I'm very difficult to live with if I don't have the next book, whatever, on my, my nightstand. But I was thinking of like Tony Hellerman in my part of the country and so forth, who writes about the Navajo, who wrote about the Navajo Nation, or Sue Grafton, that I loved, who wrote about the alphabet murders in a fictional, actually Southern California beach town. So the common element was the setting, and it sounds like that you have a common setting. And then I knew that because this was a series, you would have a common character that might become, after the first book, a cast of characters who would grow. So my question for you is, well, as I was reading, I didn't know who the common characters were. I'm reading about Zave. I didn't think he was the common character because he was young. But about the 4th chapter, and it's written in the point of view of Jon Frederick. And I thought, this is his ongoing character. But I'm curious if we're going to see in your series Zave again. And I'm wondering if you're willing to talk about that. I don't know where you are in the process of your 7th book, but I think Krista has told me that there is a 7th book coming out. And I'm wondering if you can speak to Zave and if he's going to continue, and what you see as his role in your
Zave is actually in the 7th book. He has a brief role in there, because there's part of the investigation comes to Minneapolis, where he works primarily. And so he is in the book, and in smaller roles in a few chapters, but in the series he will come back again.
Okay.
I get a case that has more to do with the metro area. The next book is called The Haunted House of Hillman.
That's what I was going to ask you, if you could tell the title. Say it again. The
Haunted House of Hillman. And so in captions, I have H2O, Haunted House of Hillman. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I think that book is going to be very popular. One thing I didn't expect with Black and Blue is it was a story I wanted to write. And I knew, my sense was that maybe it's not the perfect time for this story, but I wanted to write it. And all of my books involve actual Minnesota racial history. Okay. And so when I'm talking about the fact that the state has paid off people, after shooting and that kind of, then it's almost like a license not to make changes that, okay, they've got their $20 million, now they should be happy. And it's ridiculous because they're not addressing the roots of some of the racial issues. And so I wanted to write a book and talk about that and work it in there. And it's funny, this book has sold so well in rural Minnesota. And actually a friend of mine was saying that I never would have predicted that in 100 years, that where people almost have that attitude where they're tired about hearing metro issues, and then everybody goes out and buys your book,
Yeah.
And so it's good. It makes me feel good that
Well,
people are interested in answers.
That you knew you were going to address current racial issues?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And all of my books address them to some degree. They had different parts, like Burning Bridges gets more into Native American history.
Because this one is so timely for those people who haven't read it. With it just dovetails, you can tell me if I'm wrong, right to the George Floyd murder.
Right.
In one of your chapters. I mean, not down to, I think, within days. And
Right.
And so the characters are responding to that. And I was looking up, kind of definitions online after I read it about, true crime and what the elements of it are in that genre and so forth. And each discussion I found mentioned, that it was a common characteristic to address the political issues too, not just the actual crime, but the political setting. And I didn't realize, and then when I got to thinking about different true crime I had read, that was the case. I could go back and think of cases. Krista, I could go on. I have a couple more questions for Frank if I have time. Okay. I was, and tell us the title of your new book again.
The Haunted House of Hillman. And so I have H2O. Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, my final question for you is, again, it came from the back cover, something that interested me in the back cover, and I think Krista mentioned it. It's a true crime of lover versus psychopath. So that caught my interest. A few years ago, I had read a book, a nonfiction book called Incognito, which you might be familiar with, and it was written by a neuroscientist. So I only understood a small fraction of it, David Eagleman, but it's written in a very accessible manner. And one of the things he talks about is incarcerated people. Mostly, he looks at the male population that is incarcerated, and his statistics show, that up to 30% of those who are incarcerated have mental illnesses, and a large number of those are psychopaths. He does brain studies in incarcerated people, actually in Gallup, New Mexico. But he says, sadly, that there's really no strategy for rehabilitation of a psychopath. So I am very curious, and I think you said earlier that you interview criminals. I'm just interested in the challenges to a writer, let's say of fiction, of writing about a psychopath, having the sympathy for all the aspects of writing about a psychopath, and the challenges, and that whole issue of a writer, of whether we have a narrator or a point of view that is verifiable or that we can trust. And so you've got all these challenges, and yet I think they fascinate us. So anyway, if you could talk about psychopaths.
Well, I actually studied with Robert Hare, who's the world's expert in psychopaths in Toronto, Canada. He wrote a famous book called Without Conscience. And so I did training with him to do assessments on psychopaths. What's interesting is when we interviewed psychopaths, we'd record the interviews and then go back and look at the typed recordings of them, and circle all the places where they lied, all the contradictions, where, I dropped out of school in 9th grade, I graduated from school with honors, because they lie so frequently, they can't keep track of all of them. And so that's one of the interesting things about it. And so if I'm writing about a psychopath, I want to present that personality, that the shallowness of it. One of the best descriptions that Robert Hare uses is called parasitic lifestyle, because so many live like a parasite off of other people. Most of them typically they're living with women who are getting some sort of government assistance and not working, and it's ridiculous. And I try to emphasize when I'm doing chapters from those characters that the narcissism or the self-centeredness that you just see in the way they rationalize things.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I just thought it was. Now, do you mind if I say who I think the psychopath is in this novel?
No.
So Bobby Long is your psychopath. Is that right?
Yes.
I found this interesting too, that I think he has maybe 3 or 4 chapters in the book, his point of view chapter, but they're written in the present tense. And so the rest of your novel, I think, is all written in the simple past tense. So what does that give you access? Well, first of all, anyway, but it read almost like a police incident report, or a diary. I mean, that's what present tense, it gives you that tension, that but why did you choose to write his chapters in the present tense?
I found it easier to write the chapters from his perspective in the present tense, because I could then write how he's processing things at that very moment. Because with psychopaths, how they rationalize it later is not the same. And the moment is more truthful.
Okay.
And so you're less likely to lose the reader.
So the moment's more truthful than the reflection.
Right.
Oh, interesting. So,
Yes.
oh, well, I could probably go on.
Thank you so much.
I think Krista's
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Martha. We do have just a couple things I wanted to mention. Joey Halverson, thanks for watching tonight. She says, I love everything Frank writes.
Thank you.
Tina McKeever, fabulous book. You captured what is still happening in today's society. Thanks all of you for watching tonight as well. We have a question from Pete Rolfson. Why is there anything you ever don't write about, or any subjects that you don't write about?
Yes, that if you've noticed, none of my books involve the abuse of children, because those are situations where I just feel like that's the worst part of my job, and there's a lot of bad in my job, but I don't want to write about it. I don't want to think about it when I'm not at work, and so that my books don't involve that at all.
And now I started reading the titles mixed up. That was Black and Blue. And if you want to, Frank is going to talk to Martha about her book, Blind Eye, that he read. And I will hand it over to you, Frank.
Thank you. Martha, it's interesting, this book, Blind Eye. For someone who doesn't work in forensics, I thought you did a great job describing how the whole situation played out. That I thought I was very impressed with that. And I love some of your descriptions that like one of them talking about rural America stopping and watching law enforcement drive by. That always strikes me funny, living in rural Minnesota, where a police officer goes by and everybody walks to the window. It's like, okay, this doesn't happen all over the world, and so getting some of those descriptions, or even just small things like the 2-finger wave, that you just picture it, that it's exactly what people are doing. Or the description of Leland at the beginning, when you're kind of outlining the manner in which that the boy is receiving neglect, and talking about the weathered toys. And I just think about that, because when I read that, I was thinking about weathered toys are typically toys that are not taken care of. And because if someone plays a lot of basketball, they have a new basketball. They have, things are in good shape. And when people don't get a lot of opportunities to play, then they have the same things, that they have the same old things. and even I love some of the quotes about the investigator saying, I need to ask someone who has a horse in the race. Just one of those things that people, it just makes sense. It works well. Or even the description, he was a baby still at 4, that a good description of a child who's getting a lot of nurturing. Out of curiosity, what made you choose Roswell? And I like that you did, but
Yeah. Well, because like you, Frank, my book is fiction, definitely fiction, but was, I like to say, inspired by an actual event. And so I used the actual locations. And in so many ways, Blind Eye took me years to write. I'm not prolific like you are, but in so many ways it wrote itself, because Roswell was perfect. I mean, it stood in for so many, there's so many responses that readers from all over the country would have just because of the mere word Roswell. Whereas Roswell is a little bit of a larger, city than the rural setting that most of the book takes place in, I wanted to include Roswell. I wanted the actual settings, that the underlying story or the event that inspired the book took place, and Roswell was one of them. So,
and I thought you did a real nice job talking about how events at the time, kind of like I like working into my books, are impacting some of the characters, like Y2K is overblown. You have a character making a comment, which certainly was the case. That
yes.
Or the attack on the World Trade Center, that because those were happening during the course of the time this book was written. One of my favorite characters in the book was Linda Pruitt, and the columns were a great addition. Basically, you made a killer likable, and there were so many things that people, that even just reading those, I think a lot of people could identify with. And I was just curious about this. Is this based on someone you knew for a while? Because I just felt like that character had so much personality.
Well, thank you for asking me that question, because while this is a work of fiction, Linda Pruitt was, I've changed her name. My characters' names are all different. But those columns were actually written by the person who, the underlying story, a woman named Linda Posey. And she wrote for a ranching magazine, a weekly that came out. And so I was early on given access. I was given permission to use her columns. And, I'm sure you're the same way, Frank, as a writer. I have run into so many generous people in writing generally, and all sorts of things that I've written, but especially in writing Blind Eye. And when I contacted this was years ago, when I contacted the publication that she wrote for, I talked to the managing editor, and he said, I've got all of her columns. I have most of them, in digital format. And he sent me, and I had a stack, I still have to this day, of her columns. And so there were different, readers that I worked with and getting close to publication, and some didn't like me including her work and so forth. And I didn't want to include her work. Some of her work's included in the body of the chapters themselves. It gave me a richness, I think. But I wanted those snippets because I think she was a genuine ranch woman, So I love those columns.
And I could, as someone who grew up working on farms in central Minnesota, you work with people sometimes who do wonderful by their animals, and other people who don't. And so I really like the comment in one of her sayings that when you do your best for the animals, they do their best for you. And I could really identify with that. And I was thinking, oh, that's so good. And it's so true. And I really enjoyed that. And I also think on the flip side, starting with Peyton Pruitt, you really did a good job of making him not likable. I mean, he didn't take care of his dog, that there was just all those things that as you're moving along, that people start to develop an opinion about what this person is going to be like. And I thought that was great. How about this one? I'm kind of curious about your challenges with the Leland character, about writing about from the boy.
He was, I will say that I wrote this book in several different formats I wrote this, it didn't take 10 years to write this book, but I started it 10 years ago. And I didn't know how to write about Leland, because I don't mean to be overly sentimental, but I felt a huge responsibility to this child. And so I did not know, it took me a long time to figure out how to write from his, well, there's only one chapter from his perspective. So it was difficult. And I just felt I owed him a responsibility. So that's one of the many reasons that I write from, just like your novel, from so many points of view, to give that vision of what Leland's life was like. But I wanted to give him the final word. I wanted to give Leland the final word.
That was very good. And even I just think you do such a wonderful job describing the whole setting where it's taking place, where, you could picture the ranch, I could picture the school, I could picture all those different areas, and even some of the community's attitude about tourists, people going to Roswell for the aliens. And well, this is predominantly a ranch area. It kind of reminds me, and we used to work primarily in Brainerd and Baxter, and that whole area has a huge tourist industry, and some of the locals would refer to them as Tourons, the cross between a tourist and a moron. And I got that sense, of local people having that attitude about some of the people coming to Roswell. And that was good. That was really good.
Because go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I think all along, when I finally found my footing, that really what I wanted to write about was a community. And because when my husband and I moved back to New Mexico after many years of being away, this event had happened a few years before we came back. And it was literally, the saying, it was in the air. And there was a communal sense of responsibility. And so that's what I was trying to capture. I was trying to capture that community. And the other thing that when we moved back to New Mexico, we moved to a small rural area. I'd lived in Albuquerque. We think of Albuquerque as a big city when we live in New Mexico, and it is. But when we moved back here, we moved back to this rural area, a little town called La Luz, New Mexico. And, no one sets you down and says, here we do things this way, or you just kind of learn as you go along. And I picked up on two things, in the first couple of years after we moved there. And one was that neighboring meant something. It was completely different than living in New Jersey and having neighbors or any of the other places I've lived. It really meant something. But juxtaposed to that was the concept of we take care of our own. And it's that fierce Western independence. And so I had these, and I wanted to use this duality and so forth in my novel, these two competing concepts. And so anyway, I was working with that all the time. And I think that's what I think that's what confounded Leland. I think that's what he as a child faced. Anyway, I'm probably getting too deep in the weeds or something like that, but
no, I think this is really good. And actually, I understand that. I think you do a good job of presenting that to the reader. One of the things I talk about rural Minnesota is about the good news is everybody knows everybody. The bad news is everybody knows everybody.
Exactly.
And that's what you talk about in your book, that, and it can be generally a positive thing, but it can also be a tragedy, and it can be a disaster because people cover up for people who need to be held accountable sometimes.
Right.
And I like the way you presented that in the book. I thought you did a great job with that. I also liked your the comment about Alan Dershowitz, the attorney for O.J. Simpson, and his comment in the trial that only a fraction of women who are abused by their husbands are killed by them. I remember when I heard that comment thinking, okay, 9 out of 10 is a fraction. You know, that just it bugs me when people say things like that because it has no meaning. That and how someone might use that, an attorney might use that to minimize the abuse that someone has experienced in a situation. And again, you did a good job with that.
And I went back when I was writing that chapter, you know, I had to think twice about, you know, using 9/11 or using the O.J. Simpson case, because it's sometimes laziness to use something like that in fiction. You know, when you should be doing the work yourself, you use an event like that to stand in. But I went back and, you know, all of that, all the O.J. Simpson trial is, you know, you can go back and view it all and in real time. And I was interested, I wanted to go back and see, for one reason or another in the book, but I wanted to go back and look at Denise Brown. She was the sister of Nicole Brown. I think that's the way it went. Anyway, so I wanted to see her in the courtroom. And when Alan Dershowitz says that, it just, again, it's just like the Roswell thing. It was just like made for my novel. So, you know, it was just made for that character and for that event.
See, to me, I don't see that as laziness. I see that as expert writing, because what you're using is universal knowledge. O.J. Simpson trial, everybody knows about it. Casey Anthony, everybody knows about it. When you work those things in, people identify with it because they paid attention to it. You know, that it was, yeah. And so I think that has the potential to be very useful. And plus, again, because I think there's a moral lesson in this book, and it's an opportunity to tie it into a real life event and think about that, about how it impacted somebody in the real world.
Right.
When you wrote this book, did you have a goal of some sort set out, like, this is the message I want to deliver, this is what I wanted to do?
I'm not so sure I wanted a message. I wanted to tell the story. I felt it was such an important story, and I felt it wasn't, and I don't think it is isolated by any means. It's not an isolated story. It's a one-off. Well, you know, when I've done some appearances, the story I tell about myself is that years ago, and I'll make this fast, but years ago, when I was living in New Jersey, I had taken my daughters and a friend of theirs to an amusement park down in on the coast there in New Jersey, at Six Flags or something like that. And I took a book to read, and they were teenagers. And so I thought I would wait outside, you know, sit in the garden and read. But I was standing in line getting tickets, and this is so long ago. And there was a man and a boy then in the line next to me. And there were people everywhere. It's like Disneyland. And the man was big and burly, like a Marine or something like that. And the boy was delicate, but a teenager. He could have been 10, he could have been 14. And the man started berating the boy. And, you know, I can't remember what the language was because it's too long ago, but things like, you know, here, who do you think you are? I'm going to buy you a ticket, and swiping at him and so forth. And nobody did anything, and myself included. And why? Well, I know why, but after all these years, it's been at least 15 years that I remember that event so clearly. that, and that, so this was something that was always in my mind as I was writing Blind Eye. I thought of that boy, and then I thought of Leland, and I felt a responsibility to him. I don't know.
And you did a great job at it. It's one of the hardest parts for me reading it is I worked in a case that's almost exactly the same, a 15-year-old who shot and killed his abusive father. And I could feel that from the beginning on, my feelings about that whole situation.
We do have some questions coming in, and I want to make sure we get to them. This has just been a great conversation. I love, Joey said, I love this way to do a book conversation, two authors asking great questions. I am learning a lot. Another person, Kathy, said, people aren't statistics for sure. It's a way to cover up the pain of humanity, just like you're talking about the fraction. This is so true of a community. They do sometimes look the other way when people need help. They don't want to be the person to bring out the bad in the community, is another comment. Great insight about using O.J. Simpson, because it is a common knowledge of so many. And then somebody wanted to know if Martha has any other books and if or anything coming up.
Oh, thank you. I do have another book that's I'm supposed to get it to the publisher soon, the manuscript soon. It's completely different. It's it really doesn't have any commonality with this, but it's also something that I've tried to write over the years, here and there, and go back to, but I'm real pleased with the manuscript. So if I keep at it, I think I should have a book in the late spring, Krista. So, or early summer. So, and I've enjoyed the whole publishing process. I love to write. I'm happier when I'm writing, when I've got something I'm working on. And I didn't know whether I was going to see the publishing aspect as just a lot of work, but it's actually been a lot of fun. So, and Krista makes it a lot of fun too.
She does a great job.
It's fun working with both of you. It's just an honor and privilege to have you both part of Blue Cottage. A lot of great comments, a lot of people watching tonight. Thanks so much, everyone. Such a great author matchup, great discussion. People are learning a lot, enjoying the conversation, and yeah, great comments there. And then let's see, anybody, Frank, did you have any last minute questions for Martha before we wrap it up? We have a couple minutes.
Just a comment, the book reminded me of a quote from Shakespeare that these violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder. That's what it reminded me of. Yes.
Can you say that again, Frank? I listen more. These
violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you both for joining us tonight. I want to thank Barrett Rizek, our technical director, and Janelle Madison, our publicist. Our Blue Cottage team is awesome. Both Frank and Martha's books are available where fine books are sold. They each have a wonderful website with a blog and some wonderful extra things to read by them if you want to sign up for their newsletters and blogs. We always encourage folks to buy at their independent bookstore. So pick your favorite independent bookstore, and if any independent bookstore can get this book for you and purchase from them this holiday season. And if you missed our previous author talks, you can always find them right here at the Blue Cottage Agency channel. And as always, we invite you to like and subscribe to this channel. So we will see you next time for Author Talk. And we appreciate all of you at home watching tonight. And I hope you all have a great evening. And thanks again, Frank and Martha.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Krista.
Thanks.